Welcome to Wednesday's Rough Cut. It's my pleasure to introduce Libby Metcalf. Dr. Libby Metcalf is an associate professor of recreation and natural resource management in the W.A. Frank College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana. In 2011, Dr. Metcalf received a dual PhD at Pennsylvania State University in recreation, parks, and tourism management and the human dimensions of natural resources and the environment. Her research interests generally center around recreation management issues, wildlife-related issues, and understanding complex social ecological systems. Dr. Metcalf's theoretical approach is based on social psychology and often includes the examination of attitudes, values, and beliefs. Dr. Metcalf has worked on statewide studies examining outdoor recreation, hunter recruitment and retention issues, and river management. Her more recent work has focused on larger social ecological systems such as the social dimensions of river restoration and wildlife management. Dr. Metcalf utilizes structural equation modeling in social data analysis and has been working with other researchers to develop models to couple human and natural systems. Along with her research, Dr. Metcalf is a dedicated teacher where she provides field-based opportunities for her undergraduate students, including field trips and internships. At the graduate level, Dr. Metcalf offers seminar-style courses and close mentoring for her advisees. Thanks and welcome.
Apparently got to update my bio. Hi, I'm Libby. Some familiar faces, so thanks for coming. Today we're going to talk about the human dimensions of river restoration, and this is a project that I've been focusing on for the past 5 or 6 years, and will continue to focus on for the next 5 years. And so it's a particularly relevant and interesting topic to me. Before I get started, I need to acknowledge kind of the team of people that have helped me with this project. So I get to tell the story today, but it's really the story of all of these researchers that have been kind of collaborating on this idea of understanding how people interact with river restoration. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was a junior faculty member, I had a colleague come up to me and she said, "Oh, I think you might be really good for this one project I have. Can you just come up with a quick PowerPoint presentation to explain what you do? And I'm going to introduce you to these researchers." And so I went to a brewery, and Ray and Maury and and Kara and Jackie were all sitting around, and I didn't know these people. They were way senior than me, and I was just like frightened little junior faculty member. And so I started clicking through my ideas. And they stopped me and they said, "Well, do you drink beer?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess." And they said, "Okay, you're on the team." And so I joined this team of people, and they have since become a really close collaborators of mine and good friends, and we'll continue kind of working with them on this project. But essentially what started was Kara Nelson, kind of in the middle there. She is a professor of restoration ecology, and she said, "There's something about that makes restoration projects either successful or fail." And she goes, and it's the people. And she's like, "Libby, I don't know what that means. Like what processes are happening with these people, and how can we understand them to improve river restoration long-term?" And so we started this endeavor of trying to understand how the social component interacts with restoration to make it a successful project. And so we were very fortunate to have this great experiment out there with the Clark Fork River. And so the Clark Fork is a pretty incredible resource. It's, filters into the Columbia River, and it's also more, I guess, maybe famously known as the largest Superfund complex in the United States. And so while it's a majestic, free-flowing river right now, it did have some legacy mining from Butte, and we'll talk about that in a minute as we go on. The other components of this project I do want to acknowledge is that we've had a lot of people that have jumped onto our team. So Bob Hall recently came on, and he was interested in kind of free-flowing rivers. He works closely, he's a limnologist and thinking about how to remove dams. Teresa Floyd, the blonde there, she's in the business school, and she actually knows nothing of natural resources, but she knows about social networks. And so I'll kind of give you a teaser about some of the social network analysis that we're doing related to river restoration as well. And then of course, a bunch of grad students and other folks that helped us collect this data. I should also acknowledge the Institute on the Ecosystem and the EBSCOR program, the last round of funding, because this was primarily funded by EBSCOR and IOE. And so it's a good kind of poster child for some of the social work that kind of came out of that effort. Okay, so restoration. Has anyone worked in the restoration field? Oh, got one hand. That's excellent. And so restoration is kind of a newer field of study. It pulls a lot from kind of ecology, biology, and a bunch of other disciplines. But for a while, there wasn't an understanding of kind of how humans interacted with restoration. So whether it mean the businesses that were involved with restoration or the people actually implementing restoration on the ground, there was some kind of confusion about how people interacted. And so in 2005, between 2005 and 2010, there's this body of literature that kind of came out from restoration ecologists calling for more social science research. And as a social scientist, I'm like, yes, this is great. People matter. And so it has kind of paved this road for kind of this human dimensions of restoration to pop up. And so Bernhardt had this one article in 2005 where she spoke to the fact that ecological and social factors were both important when we kind of think about restoration. Other folks like Margaret Palmer was documenting that successful river restoration efforts all had some element of citizen involvement with it. And so there's this piece of like, if we engage citizens, that maybe this restoration effort might be more successful. And then some other folks were starting to think about how public attitudes interacted with all of that. And so all of that kind of work laid the foundation for our research. And so today I'm going to focus primarily on three concepts and how they interact with restoration. And the first one is this idea of trust. And so anyone who talks to me or works with me knows that I kind of harp on this issue of trust in natural resource decision making. So trust is the willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party based on the expectation that the other party will perform a particular action important to the truster, irrespective of the ability to monitor or control that other party. Huge, technological definition of trust. Essentially what we're trying to get at is, how do people, the citizens of a restoration effort, a community, how do agencies, how do leaders trust the process and trust each other in order to make a restoration project successful? And we see trust coming out in a whole host of different natural resource situations. So it's not unique to river restoration, but we had a strong feeling that trust was part of this. The other piece is this idea of stakeholder and public involvement. And so I don't know, we all kind of, or I hope we all exercised one of our best approaches to public involvement and voted yesterday. So that's one format of public involvement, but has anyone ever been part of like a public comment period or public comment process? Yeah, and you kind of throw your public comment into the black box and you're like, oh, did they do anything with that? That's a form of public engagement and public involvement. Sometimes going to like a citizen-led meeting. In Missoula, for example, there's like you can go any given day, there's some meeting going on about something that you should take action on. And so that's public involvement. That's a good joke. Some people laugh, I love it. And so that's the other piece of kind of understanding this quagmire of restoration. And then lastly, this idea of success. And so I'm going to come back to success because it's kind of a funky little measure. How do we know something is successful? There are a whole host of different things that we can actually use to measure that success. So for this project, we were interested in those things: trust, public engagement, and restoration success. We know that trust is critical. And we know that from previous research. There's a whole host of different types of trust. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time kind of dissecting what trust is, but how many people in here think they have a trusting personality? Like, you're willing to like trust anyone? One couple of people. I'm that way. I'm like, yeah, okay, you have a badge on, I'll trust you. Like, there's all these things that you can do, like that's called dispositional trust. You have like a disposition to be a trusting human being. Then there's kind of procedural trust, which is trust in the process, trust in kind of, the government to actually follow a just and fair procedures. There's affinitive trust, and this is where I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about, but that's kind of a shared value trust. So I share the same values as Rob here, and so we have this kind of shared value trust. We also, that affinitive trust can also be a connectedness or a social connectedness with one another. And affinitive trust, and I'll come back to this, it was something that was very popular or was very relevant in this river restoration project. And then lastly, we have kind of rational trust, which is kind of based on norms, and I'm not going to delve too much into it, but I just want you to know that trust is a complex social construct, and there's all these different elements to it. And so I'm not trying to gloss over it, but just for the sake of time. Okay, so we wanted to look at these three things in a river restoration context. And so, like I said, we decided to examine the Clark Fork River. We know it's one of the largest Superfund complex in the United States. It's actually made up of 4 operable units. And you can kind of see the coloring. You can't see the 4th unit, which is Missoula, essentially, so the Milltown Dam removal. And so that was one of the bigger keystone projects on this Superfund group. In the late 19th century, there was a ton of mining that was happening in Butte with gold, silver, and copper, known as the richest hill on earth. That mining operation had serious impacts on Silver Bow and Warm Springs creeks, and those are the 2 feeders into the Clark Fork River. And arsenic and heavy metals were dropped in that river. If you drive along I-90, you can see the kind of scars of that mining operation. So everything from the Berkeley Pit in Butte, down to the smelter in Anaconda, down to the kind of slicks as you go through into Deer Lodge. And so it still is, the landscape is still scarred from it. In the early 80s, there was a lot of arsenic found in drinking water in Missoula. And so it became this kind of activist thing that was happening in Missoula. Missoulians were saying, we need clean drinking water. The Clark Fork is part of that. The Milltown Dam sat at the mouth of Hellgate Canyon. And essentially what was happening was all the metals were kind of beaten up against the dam and kind of settling right there. There's a couple flooding events that also occurred. So this is one of those things that made Missoulians kind of freak out over it. And they said, we need to do something about this. And so that was one of those things that kind of, I would say, a catalyst for this Superfund designation. So in the 80s, there was the state of Montana filed a lawsuit against ARCO, Atlantic Richfield Corporation. And over the course of the late 90s and into the early 2000s, there was 3 different settlements totaling over $400 million. And so all of a sudden we get this settlement of $400 million. And Montana's like, woohoo, like, let's do this. And so when I first got to Montana, they were still having meetings about how that money was going to be distributed across the Superfund project. When we think about this project, it's kind of interesting. So if anyone's following this project currently, there's a lot coming out right now about the health and human impacts of that mining in those communities of Butte and Anaconda and Opportunity. Largely, most of the restoration has taken place downstream. And so the first thing we did was remove the dam in Missoula, took that dam out in 2008, and then began repairing that the floodplain and the channels through that stretch of river. Silver Bow and Warm Springs were kind of slowly being worked on, and now we're kind of moving a little bit more upstream and doing some of the restoration up there. The timing of all this is something that's pretty critical in this story of the Clark Fork River. Back in 1999, there was a lot of commotion and a lot of discussion about how that restoration was to occur. And so all of these communities along the Clark Fork River started hearing about this. Landowners were approached. They said, we need to get onto your property to restore this piece of the land. And so all these ranchers and farmers said, yes, this is great. Let's do this. Let's do this. We are now in, 2018, and some of those pieces of property still have not been restored or remediated. And so when I start talking about some of the challenges with building trust and how the public has been engaged, remember that time span, because it is a critical piece of this story. Okay, so we have this crazy experiment and this crazy place to do this research to understand restoration. And so we kind of had to develop an idea of what are we going to do. I don't know if this schematic is really that good, but at least puts everything on the same page. And so some of you have seen this. Today I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about a household survey we did, and then a series of key informant interviews that we did. And with the idea of talking about trust, public engagement, and how that actually impacts restoration success. We have three, maybe I shouldn't say this in a presentation, 3 failed coupled human natural system grants into the NSF related to this topic. So solid research productivity on my behalf. The last one we did the best, and we had excellent to very good reviews and one kind of bad reviewer who didn't like what we were doing. But that's okay, we'll try again, try again. But the idea is to look at it from a social ecological perspective. And so not only acknowledge that social science piece, but then bring in the ecology. And so we've been talking a lot about how, what are those indicators of restoration success from an ecological standpoint? Is it number of fish? Is it, diversity of vegetation in the riparian area? Is it nitrates or reduced nitrates in the river? Whatever those things are, and pairing that data with the social data. And so that's the ultimate goal, is to take this and develop a model of restoration success that has ecological variables and social variables together to predict, is this project a success or not? And so that's the ultimate outcome, and I'm hopeful that we'll get there. I have faith in ourselves. Okay, so today I am going to talk specifically, though, about our 2 studies that we did in 2013 and 2016. And so I'm going to need you guys to become social scientists now and think, like a social scientist, think about people. I primarily do mixed method research. And so what I mean by mixed method research for me is that I do qualitative and quantitative data collection. And so when I'm talking about qualitative data collection, I'm usually using in-depth interviews. And so I sit down with 20 to 50 people and have these kind of hour to 2 hour long interviews with a guided interview guide where I ask them a series of questions, and then I probe on these questions. And your data source in those qualitative interviews are words. And so that's the data that comes out. And so I will present some of those words today as from that qualitative piece. And so keeping on the qualitative, we did these semi-structured interviews in summer of 2013. And again, the data is a little old, but I think it's still relevant. And we wanted to measure the success of the river. Like, how did these folks think about river success or restoration success? And I'll tell you the people that we sampled, because it was all sorts of different groups and entities. We used a purposive chain referral system. So I started with kind of a couple key informants, and I said, tell me the people who have been involved with river restoration. And I write those down, and then next person I interview, I ask them to kind of provide a list of folks, and we move out from there. We collected a total of 40 interviews, and it was a massive effort. And so think about sitting down with 40 people for over a couple hours. It's a long time. We transcribe all of our interviews by a professional transcriptionist, and then we go through that interview, that transcription, and actually code the data. And so I take passages and code it with a certain title, and then usually you end up with a data set of like 40 or 50 codes, and then you start pulling themes out of that data. So that's kind of the quick and dirty and qualitative. We also knew that our qualitative interviews were primarily with kind of leaders on restoration, so we weren't really talking to citizens. And so we really wanted to get at how citizens also felt about the restoration. And so we did a survey of folks in Milltown. And so we wanted a completed restoration effort. And so that's why we focused on Milltown. And so we were in Bonner, Milltown area, and we did a intercept method, which was kind of fun and weird all at the same time. And so we sent this is like our, let's reduce data collection costs. And so we sent Fred, one of our Alex's grad student, out to collect data. And I remember my favorite moment is we had a day off, and Fred called us, and he's like, I've been bitten by a dog. And we're like, oh shit, Fred, like, what are we gonna do? Like, we gotta get you. And so we were skiing, I think we were skiing, and we had to stop work and deal with it. So that's why getting people, you know how it is, getting people into the field, there's always something. And so we essentially knocked on doors and folks in Bonner and Milltown and said, will you fill out our survey? And some people did and some people didn't. And so the quantitative survey was really citizen focused. And so I'm going to toggle between like understanding leaders' perspectives and then also understanding citizens' perspectives. And so hopefully I've done it in like a visual way that makes you know which one I'm talking about. We'll see. Okay, so our in-depth interviews, we wanted to kind of understand the breadth of people who are involved with restoration. And so we talked to NGOs, we talked to citizens groups, we talked to a lot of agencies, so everything from federal, state to tribal governments. We talked to an outfitter and guide. We talked to 7 restoration businesses, so the people that were actually doing a lot of the restoration on the ground. And then we talked to some landowners along the Clark Fork to get their voice heard as well. For our survey, we interviewed 123 citizens, and so we did a quantitative survey with 123 folks. We thought we would get a slightly more higher response rate with the intercept method, but it just didn't pan out for us. And so that is a limitation of the study. Okay, so let's talk about the key findings. So I'm going to start with restoration goals, mainly to kind of paint the picture of how we measure success. So anytime you talk to somebody about, was this project successful, they ultimately go back to restoration goals. Well, what were the goals of the project? And so you have to kind of hold restoration goals and success with each other, and they're very much closely tied. So when we interviewed folks, a lot of people mentioned that the goal of restoration was based on protecting human health and the environment. That's what you hear, that's CERCLA law, that's Superfund law, that's clearly stated part of Superfund, is that you are protecting the natural environment and you're protecting human health. But then people quickly went into, well, on this project, even though human health was important and even though the environment was important, we really wanted healthy fish populations. And so this is actually a thing that came out quite a bit. People had a goal towards healthy fish populations. Clean water was also a goal. Developing opportunities for recreation was also a goal, and then bank stabilization. And so these came out of our interviews as the main things that people were interested in. And so if you compare that with how citizens thought about restoration, it was similar but a little bit different. And so we asked folks to rate goals on a 1 to 5 scale, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. And so this is our citizens in Milltown and Bonner. And the number 1 goal was clean water. And so the citizens recognized that clean water is an important piece of Superfund cleanup. Quality of wildlife habitat, human health, all were kind of second and third, followed by quality of aquatic habitat and healthy river vegetation. Things that didn't kind of bubble to this top that still were important, but not as important, were kind of aesthetics, recreation experiences, and opportunities for economic development. And so sometimes we'll see the conversation around the Milltown Dam removal be talk about opportunities for, we now have a state park, it'll bring tourism dollars in, it'll be an important revenue generator. And for citizens in that area, it wasn't as strong. So now I'm going to move us on to kind of restoration success. And so those are the goals of the project. If we think about restoration success, it's actually quite challenging to actually measure. So how do we know a project was successful? All of us who have a different science background might come at it from a very different perspective. You might say, for me, a project would be successful when people felt like they were heard, their voices were heard. That's probably much, much different than if I was talking to a stream ecologist and their measure of success is fish populations. And so we wanted to kind of understand how people were measuring success, and it varied quite a bit. One of our interviewees said there are several factors that go into calling it a successful cleanup. One of the most obvious would be fish populations. The vegetation and how it does would be a measure of success. The stability of the stream banks that are reconstructed. I mentioned the schedule. That's always important to people, whether it was a time or closely on time. And then you could also measure the impacts of the economy. And so this particular interviewee that we had was like, it's everything in the kitchen sink. Everything's success. And so what do you do with that as a researcher? How do you start making sense of this? Like, what is the actual measure of restoration success? And so this is something that we've thought about as a team and as a collective group. And we actually pulled out of the business field this idea of satisfaction. So a lot of you might go to a restaurant and fill out a satisfaction comment card. This is like a habit of mine. I love filling out surveys, and I love critiquing surveys. And so I go in and I'm like, okay, I'm at Cafe Rio. Let's see what we got. And I kind of critique it and fill it out. And so satisfaction measures are very much closely tied to service quality. And so we use satisfaction as a proxy for success of river restoration. And it was particularly relevant. I use satisfaction quite a bit, and so do our colleagues over in the business school that were part of this project. And so it was a good measure for us to think about. And so we had these general kind of satisfaction measures. It said, I'm satisfied with the outcome we achieved here in Milltown Dam removal and river cleanup. Overall, I would describe the Clark Fork River cleanup as a success. I'm satisfied with the Clark Fork River cleanup project as a whole, and the outcome of Milltown Dam removal and river cleanup did not meet my expectations. And so we had these very general measures of satisfaction. We also went into those very specific things as well. So we measured satisfaction on, number of fish populations, recreation opportunities, clean water, and those other restoration goals that we talked about. But I'm not going to focus on that research today. And so what we found is that even though we had these satisfaction measures, and we asked them on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree, people were not that satisfied. This is low for me. If I'm looking at satisfaction on like recreation experiences, it's actually a little bit low, but that's okay. We can talk about why that is in a little bit, and I think we have some answers to that. So we'll think about, so that's how we measured satisfaction or success, and we'll come back to that measure in a little bit. So let's go into trust and talk about that next metric that we were thinking about. And so this is one of our independent variables, which is building of trust. And so when we interviewed folks, they said trust was critical in natural resource decision-making. And we heard a couple things pop out. When we asked about trust, time delays was a very salient thing that people kind of commented on. The time delay between when the settlement actually happened in the late 1990s to when actual restoration was happening on the ground. In some instances, people had not been talked to about restoration in over a decade. And so that was something that erodes trust for individuals. While the government came and talked to me, the DEQ, the EPA, they were talking to me in 2001, and now I haven't heard anything. And so what's happening on this river? Is it even being cleaned up? Did they just take all that money and pocket it? Those were the type of things that we heard when we were talking with folks on the ground. And so think about that Western mentality and the general mistrust in government that happens across rural Montana. And that was very much part of this narrative. Other things that were kind of influential in building or not building trust was how the public was engaged. And so a lot of people, a lot of our NGOs, for example, said the public engagement was outstanding on this project. It was outstanding. And then you talk to landowners and they're like, no one engaged me. I don't know what happened. Like, there was no public meeting. Oh, there was a public meeting, but it was only for those people that ARCO got together in a citizen group. And so there was the haves and have-nots, who was invited to the table to actually be part of that process. Other things that were seen as kind of trust builders were good communication, the building of relationships, and appropriate engagement that did build trust. One of the kind of bright lines in all of this was kind of the influence of NGOs and their impact on the river restoration project. So folks from TU and Clark Fork Coalition who actually developed kind of these relationship building approaches and got on people's land. There were a couple key individuals as well. I could list these guys off, and they were influential in sitting down with landowners and sitting down with like kind of interested parties and saying, let's talk about what restoration is the most appropriate for you. And so it takes time, like this quote says, you have to build trust one person at a time. You have to be patient, and you have to be careful that you don't make any blunders along the way, because there's people looking for you to reveal your hand and that you really don't give a damn about agriculture, and all you want is to preserve fish. And so this is one landowner who is like, I'm watching. I know, if you don't screw this up. So what we decided to do on our quantitative survey is actually measure trust. Some folks might argue that you shouldn't measure trust in a quantitative ways. I think you can kind of measure things in all sorts of different ways, and so you might as well try a little bit of everything. We looked at trust from a whole range of different perspectives. We looked at dispositional trust, we looked at procedural trust, we looked at moral competency, we looked at technical competency, but today I'm just going to talk about this affinitive measure. We have forthcoming some research out about how these trust measures are actually kind of work in a structural equation model. There isn't actually a lot of, well, it's becoming more increasingly so, but not a lot of people actually have quantified trust when we started creating this survey. And so we didn't have a lot of quantitative measures to kind of choose from. And so we were kind of pigeonholed into like 1 or 2 approaches. But something that kind of came out for us was this idea of affinitive trust. And so this is where you have shared values, and a lot of times when you measure trust, you have to measure it towards a particular organization or towards a particular thing. And so in this instance, we debated on who it should be. Should it be the EPA? Should it be the DEQ? Should it be NGOs? And we decided that the best way to orient our trust was towards the Department of Environmental Quality. And so all of the questions that we asked were focused on the DEQ. And that was because the DEQ was in charge of this restoration effort. And so when we think about affinitive trust, so does this agency or this organization share the values that I have? And then also, do I feel like I'm connected to that organization? And so those two things together build this idea of affinitive trust, or your beliefs and how about perspectives and desired outcomes. And so our affinitive shared values measures were the DEQ supports my views, the DEQ has similar goals to mine, the DEQ thinks like me, and the DEQ shares my values. And we saw that those were a little bit low, right? It was a 5-point scale with 5 being strongly agree and 1 being strongly disagree. And they were under 3. So that means that folks tended to disagree with these statements, and suggesting that citizens in Milltown and Bonner did not feel like the DEQ had that shared value structure that they had. The second piece is this connectedness. So you might not have shared values, but you might still feel connected to individuals on the ground. And so I felt I could connect with the DEQ. DEQ personnel were easy to get along with. DEQ personnel were generally positive, and I could relate to the DEQ personnel. And that was kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes they felt like, yeah, the DEQ was a little bit positive, or I could get along with them. But no, I couldn't relate to them, and I couldn't actually connect with them. And so that was a kind of interesting to see how Milltown and Bonner residents felt about that. Okay, so that was trust. Now we're going to move on to public engagement. I'm going to show you how all these things work together in a model at the end. I promise you, there'll be a big, like, shiny bow on everything. So public engagement was another interesting thing that kind of came out of our interviews. And so there was a mixed bag on how people felt they were engaged on river restoration. It depended on the location. And this is something that was actually one of the more striking things that has motivated my research kind of from here on out. People talked explicitly about how Milltown and Missoula got everything. Milltown and Missoula, they got their dam removed. They got their river cleaned up. I'm in Opportunity, Montana, and I got all of Milltown's crap up on my hill. And that's literally what's happened. You go into Anaconda and you're like, wow, that's a really massive hill of stuff. And so that was that idea that there was disparities across the river and across the river landscape. And so you can pull in things from social justice literature to kind of start exploring that. And so that's kind of what we did, and I'll show you how we kind of went about it. So the location depended a lot on how people felt that they were engaged. Citizen groups were seen as a particularly relevant and positive thing. Site tours, newsletters, and public meetings, so the kind of more traditional approaches to engage the public, were also seen as positive. However, there was a group of folks that felt like the process was determined before there was any public input. And so some folks in this group said, you know what, it didn't matter if I engaged. Somebody already decided what was going to happen. Somebody already decided how that restoration was going to occur. And so my comments actually didn't matter at all. And some folks also felt like there were closed-door negotiations. And this wasn't just from landowners. It was across NGOs. It was across even agencies. And so tribal partners saying, you know what, I didn't have a seat at the table, or I was brought to the table too late. NGOs feeling like they were excluded from any type of negotiation on any of this stuff. And so how you engaged, whether it was the citizens or different organizations, was not cohesive at all. And so, but there were some positive experiences from it. So public engagement and interest, and maybe the NGO deserves a lot of credit because they've been in it for the long haul and have done a lot to make sure that the public voice was heard and to get the public involved. And so that's something that we saw emerge out of this project, was the agencies maybe not engaging the public as appropriately as the public wanted, but the NGOs spending that time to do that. And I think that continues today. If I were to suggest, I feel like the agencies or the NGOs are doing a really good job. So when we looked at public engagement, you can measure public engagement in a lot of different ways. You can measure it by how many public meetings people go to, how many times they write to their senator, how many times they read a newsletter about something. And so you can kind of do these quantifications of like public engagement activities. But then you can also get at kind of a deeper level of public engagement. And so for the case of the Clark Fork River, we thought that public engagement and procedural justice were closely tied. And so this kind of gets a little bit into the social justice literature. But essentially procedural justice is that kind of looks at two things. Was the process fair? And did the decisions that came out of that process, did I feel I was part of that decision-making process? And so we have this process control and we have this decision control. And so our process control measures were, I had a sufficient opportunity to comment on the river restoration process. There were ample opportunities for public input. The local community was involved in the decision-making process, and I was able to participate in the decisions about the river. And folks felt, this was on a 1 to 5 scale, folks generally felt like they had a chance to be part of that process. They felt like there was opportunities to engage. They felt like there was meetings that they could go to. What was a little bit different was that decision control. So public comment were seriously considered. Minds were made up before the public had a chance to comment. Public comment felt meaningless, and final decisions balanced the concerns for all people. And people felt like that those decisions that were made, that they didn't agree with those statements. And so you can see those lower under that middle mark. So 2.9, 2.4, 2.8, 2.9. And so even though people felt like they had a chance to engage, they didn't feel like their voices were part of that decision-making process. And so we'll see how that kind of translated. And so we had Fred, our master student, actually looked at this for his thesis. And so he looked at how process and decision interacted to help predict satisfaction or success of the river restoration. So did this matter? Did public engagement or procedural justice matter in determining the success of river restoration? And what we found is that we had a fully mediated model, which is quite challenging in social science to have a fully mediated model. So we're sometimes still like, is that really what we found? It's published now, so it's got to be fact, right? And so what we found is that even though we had anticipated that people could feel part of the process and that they would still feel like the project was a success, and that line didn't go out or wasn't actually there. What happened is that people needed to be part of that process, and they needed to have a feeling like they were part of that decision-making process as well, and to actually impact restoration success. And so those two things both needed to be there in order for restoration success to happen. And so we took that and I said, let's see how trust interacts with this. This is public engagement, procedural justice, but now I want to see how trust actually comes in to predict this. So we have the public engagement line of this. Now let's look at the trust line of this. And so that's what we did. We looked at that affinitive trust, and we broke down the shared values and the social connectedness. And what we found is that together, procedural justice and affinitive trust both were needed to have restoration success. And so this was like, of course, like my hypothesis was met. This is brilliant. And so, and this isn't like something unique or new. Like this is exactly what the literature says. Yeah, you need both these things to have a success. And so what we found, and we were predicted about 52% of the variance, which is quite high in social science. Usually we're like 20%, woo. And so what we find is that together, if we have trust and public engagement, that we have a more successful approach to river restoration. And so this was kind of like the culmination of the social science piece of this, is that we need both of these things together. We had that qualitative data that laid the foundation to say that trust and public engagement were important. And now we have this quantitative piece to kind of verify that and say, yeah, for citizens, if there's a strong connection between themselves and the agency, that there will be a higher likelihood of satisfaction with that project. And so going back to my original points of like, yeah, how do people engage, and how does the social or human dimension matter in river restoration success? This is it. We need kind of we need public engagement processes that are actually meaningful. So have a chance to comment, but also know that your comments are actually part of the decision-making process. And then also having that trust together in concert with one another. So I'm going to repeat myself in a couple good conclusions. We're not done. I have like 10 minutes. Yeah, I have like couple more things I'll talk to you about. I promise. So it may seem, a lot of this may seem trivial to you guys, but it's actually quite incredibly important to understand how these paths and how people think about restoration success. We know that that social engagement processes need to be fair and deliberative. It's not enough just to have a public engagement opportunity. People need to be part of that decision-making process. And so we have this article that Fred, Alex, myself, and Jackie wrote on public engagement and social ecological systems management that's focused on the Milltown Dam project. And so if you're looking for more on that, you can find it in that citation. More importantly, having trust and public engagement together is something that has been looked at a little bit in the literature, but hasn't been pulled together in this quantitative way. And so when I think about the contribution of this research and how we think about restoration moving forward, it's the fact that we've developed these quantitative measures that can kind of work in concert with one another. Trust is a very difficult thing to measure. And I'm not sure this project has actually, I think we have a start of some really awesome measures of trust, but I think there's a lot of that we could be doing to kind of improve these measures and test them a little more. Even this morning, as I was going over it, I was like, oh, maybe I should have done the analysis this way, or maybe we should have asked these sets of questions instead of the ones that we actually asked. And so I feel like it was our first attempt, and it was a first good attempt, and we'll continue to kind of examine it. We also know that I haven't thrown this into a structural equation model yet, and so how these kind of variables interact with each other a little more might give us a slightly different view on all of this. So in terms of like, if I were to tell you some of the kind of management implications of this, I think one of the big things that we had heard is that even though Milltown and that portion of the Clark Fork River was it's often been perceived or communicated as a huge success, that for some folks it wasn't a huge success. We know that. There are some, I think overall I would probably argue that it was successful, but there's a lot more that we could be doing. And as we're thinking about upstream, and as we're thinking about how we restore Butte and Anaconda and some of those other places along the Clark Fork, we need to think about how trust and public engagement come into this. Now, we're starting to think about that a little bit from a social network perspective. So these are social networks, and this is my teaser. This is like my last 3 slides are like teasers of things that we're doing in our forthcoming research. So Teresa and I have been working on this. Has anyone ever seen a social network analysis? Yeah, a couple of you guys. They're kind of funky. I hated them for so long, and then Teresa totally changed my mind on them. And so essentially you have different types of networks, and so you can have a diffuse network, and so that kind of one all the way over on the left-hand side or your right-hand side. And diffuse networks tend to have decentralized power. We have these kind of more cohesive networks that are like this big one, and that's kind of what you want when you have a social network, like a lot of people interacting with each other. It suggests that you're building trust. It suggests that your network is strong and people and communication are all flowing back and forth. So we decided to do this on Milltown Dam. And so we interviewed, so this is like a PhD student of mine, interviewed close to 200 people that were involved with the decision-making of Milltown Dam, and asked them to fill out these networks. And so we asked them to identify people. And so we had a list of about 100 people. So it said Libby Metcalf, and you got to say about Libby Metcalf, did I interact with Libby, and how frequent was that interaction? You also got to say, I did not trust this human being. I did not trust Libby Metcalf, or I had conflict with Libby Metcalf. You got to identify people. And this was all, if you're thinking about oh my God, did she go through our IRB or our review board? We did, and we had to get buy-in from all of those people to be on our list. And so all of these people in the Clark Fork project or the Milltown Dam project were like, yeah, okay. And we told them exactly what they were gonna be and how it was gonna be used. Now we don't identify the people here, and you can see each of the colors are associated with a particular group, and we've aggregated in a way that you won't be able to identify who an individual node is, which is really important. So we know on the Milltown Dam project that a lot of people were interacting with each other. What's a little more interesting is this is the avoidance network. So we asked people who are they avoiding? I don't know who that person that person in the red, that citizen. There was one rogue citizen that everyone was like, no, thank you. So it was, so I have to, it takes everything I have to not go in and figure out who that person is. But that's what happens. And so you can figure out there are some project leaders that people were avoiding, and there were some technicians that people were avoiding. And so that this helps us paint the picture of how people are engaging and how we use this. What we ultimately are doing is throwing this into a big path analysis or structural equation model and trying to see how those network structures actually predict that satisfaction. And so we're building on that trust model that we have in that public engagement model and using those networks to understand this kind of social piece of it. Okay, I have 5 minutes. So that'll be coming out soon. I also want to just touch on that this project, we had 2 collaborators from the business school. So Jackie Moore, who some of you might know, she's pretty incredible in terms of marketing, and a lot of her work has been focused on like biomimicry, so how nature mimics, or businesses mimic nature. And she's been thinking about how businesses engage in restoration. So there's that social piece like that I'm talking about, and then there's this piece of that we have these kind of entities that are charged with actually doing the restoration on the ground. And so how are they thinking about restoration? And so we had this article that came out, and it was just kind of interesting. I don't know if there's any business folks here, but the idea that restoration businesses are actually trying to juggle multiple and competing restoration goals. So ecological integrity with profitability. So you have a business that's actually doing this restoration on the ground. Are they being innovative? Are they taking risks? Are they doing what's best for the ecosystem? Or are they doing what's best for their profit line? And so those are the questions we asked of these small businesses that were focused on restoration. And what we learned from it is that people actually had this very strong moral dilemma between how they manage their restoration projects in terms of getting those ecological goals met with still meeting their financial bottom line. And they said, we are trying to do what's best for the environment, but sometimes we can't do what's ultimately best because we have to pay our bills. And so there was this really kind of strong tension in some of these businesses. We also see things like disconnect between science and practice, which has been talked about a lot. And then also how people become innovative in restoration. And so I'm not a person who knows anything about innovation. I'm like pretty boring. Like this is like a very boring talk. But restoration businesses are trying to like be innovative, and they're not quite there yet. There's approaches that they're relying on that might be, as a restoration ecologist, might not be the best approach to restoring that river. And they just don't know, or they don't know how to take that risk to make that innovation successful. And so there's that, so in restoration ecology, Jackie and I have an article about that. Okay, so last 3 minutes I get to talk about where I'm going. And so I have some of my crew's researchers here, so that's good. We've been thinking a lot about Milltown on this project and how Milltown was impacted from the restoration effort. But now what we want to do is kind of start working upstream. And communities of Anaconda and Deer Lodge in particular and Opportunity have had very little social science inquiry. And so we can pause it, and we've heard articles, we've heard news stories, we're hearing a lot about health and human impacts from legacy mining and water contamination. And so now we're going to kind of take a community resilience perspective and look at those communities. And when I'm talking about community resilience, I'm thinking a little bit about how communities bounce back or bounce forward after a stressor. And so myself and Julia Haggerty here at MSU are leading that effort for the Natural Resource Social Science team as part of the EBSCOR Cruise project. And so we're going to be focused on the Clark Fork River, but then we're going to apply the same framework across 2 other contexts. And so we'll be looking at the Judith and Judith River Valley, or Judith Valley, and then also the Powder River. And so looking at energy and ag and how some of these measures kind of connect in with that. And so I'm really excited to kind of start working up in Anaconda and Opportunity. I haven't spent much time there for research. And so our first kind of order of business is, I was just talking to one of my collaborators, Ben Coleman, who looks at little things in water, right? That's a good way to describe him. Ben and I were talking about doing a little field trip up to Anaconda and doing some initial interviews and just letting the communities know that we're starting to work on this research project in that area. And so I think it'd be really neat to kind of take a community resilience perspective to try to understand how are these communities thinking about trust, how they're thinking about engagement processes, and how is that actually building resilience in those communities for long-term success and long-term well-being as we move on. Okay, so with that, I will, that is a fish from the Clark Fork River. One of the coolest things, sorry, side note, in the interviews, the very heartfelt stories of being able to go through the river without a dam was one of the most incredible parts of interviewing 40 or so people on the river. And so having a free-flowing river was just one of these things that people commented on over and over and over again. And if you have not floated that section of river, it is magical, and there are monsters in there. And so perhaps an indicator of success. I don't know. So thank you. Yeah.
I think it was the first question on your satisfaction survey where the standard deviation was also 3.
Yeah,
that sounds like a big standard deviation to number to go from 1 to 5.
Yes, I actually think that was a typo. I will say that because the other SDs are actually quite smaller, right? Let me go back and yeah, I think that might be I feel like that should have come out.
Well, maybe my question is still.
It's still appropriate.
Interesting.
It's still appropriate.
When you do these quantitative surveys like that, and your mean is 3, and you have a big standard deviation, you go back and look at that distribution, say, is 3 really the answer people are giving, or is that just this artificial number between 1s and 5s?
Well, it's a great question because it suggests that when we just look at a mean, it doesn't tell you the whole story. And so tomorrow we're giving a talk in the ecology seminar where we look at kind of that standard deviation and how far apart people are from that mean, because it doesn't tell the whole story, right? And so if we actually, the nice part about this research is that we only have 123 people, so we could go person by person and see where that spread is, and that's more meaningful. It also, I feel like, so I reported means today because that was like probably the most, I tried to think about the most simple thing to do in this presentation. And it, thinking a little bit more critically about which data to actually present and how to present it is probably a great thought and a great comment. But yeah, this is not, maybe it's not telling the whole story. Yeah.
I guess the numbers smell a little bimodal to me.
Yes, which is.
And wouldn't that imply that we have trusters and non-trusters?
Well, that's a great thing. And so like that bimodal, so there is like the normal distribution in social science just doesn't really happen, like, right? People are not normally distributed, we know this, like, and so it probably is more bimodal, that you had people who are like really satisfied. And this was the citizens, remember, and they're looking at satisfaction. And so if we actually uncover what was going on with citizens at that time, it tells a different story. So we had a lot of folks in Bonner and Milltown who were not thrilled about restoration. They were angry. They lost a huge water body that was they connected to culturally, historically, with familial ties. And so it didn't matter what happened, they were going to be angry with restoration happening. And so you're probably right. There was a group that was not thrilled about it. And then there was a group that was actually thrilled about it and wanted to see it happen. And so maybe a better analysis would be kind of pulling those people, like the satisfied and the least satisfied, and doing a different type of a t-test or something a little bit different.
The other it's about the sociodemographics. I actually stopped in Milltown starting it was a Sunday morning, and I basically walked into a trailer park there, and the dogs were barking. And, it was not a rich area, and then the mill was closed there also. So what is this attention that in your qualitative?
I think your point, you're picking up something that is actually, I think, quite true. And as we think about moving upstream, I think we'll have similar, perhaps demographics that we might have to contend with. So the difference between Anaconda and Opportunity is quite drastic. And the difference between Milltown and Missoula is quite drastic. And your point of, you stumbled into a trailer park, that is a big piece of how Milltown and Bonner, that is what those kind of economic groups is what you see. I didn't present any of our social, some of that demographic data, and just for sake of time. And I actually I can't recall what it is right now, but yeah, it tends to be lower income, a little bit more of a depressed area. Although there's things that are happening in Bonner and Milltown that are cool, but maybe not bringing in the jobs that we thought. So good point.
Has there been any interest in querying the participants after this study, what they thought could be done better?
Yeah, so we did have some open-ended questions, both on our qualitative interviews that we did in 2013, there was a lot of commentary about what we could do differently and do better. And one of the things that came out was, I didn't really talk about landowners in this presentation just because there's too much, but people said over and over again that landowners were left out of the equation completely. And so all of private landowners that are in that stretch from Milltown all the way up to Butte, ranchers, farmers, just landowners, were not engaged in an appropriate way. And so thinking forward, how do we make restoration more successful? It's engaging people on the ground. And so there are these beautiful examples of TU spending time up on Warm Springs Creek and up in Silver Bow, meeting with each of the landowners and having these very nice success stories, but that wasn't happening on the main stem. So yeah, that was one of them. Sorry, there's probably more that we could dig out. Yeah, Rich.
Yeah, you showed some kind of process diagrams, or some circle and arrow diagrams.
This guy.
Well, I think the one that had two that flowed into one.
This guy.
Yeah. So there was kind of, and that shows that both affinitive trust and process are important for satisfaction. That's causality.
Mm.
But how do you know the direction of causality here? Because it would seem to me, if I hate what they did, then I'm going to hate the process and I'm going to not trust it. If I love what they did, then I think they must have been a great process. They must have been following my values.
You bring up the biggest issue in social science, quantitative social science research, right? This idea that these are recursive, right? These are things that feed back onto each other. And I don't think I personally don't have the suite of tools. I'm sure some great new PhD does, to test all the kind of interactions of this stuff. Yeah, it suggests causality. It suggests if we just build affinitive trust that people will be more satisfied, or that if we just have these processes that are fair and just, that we will have more success. And that might not be it. It could, so it gets at kind of those core beliefs and norms and values that we all have. Now, that's an area of research that I spend thinking about, and I always think that values, in fact, predict a lot of this type of stuff. But yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. I think you're dead on to suggest that trust will ultimately impact satisfaction. There's more to it than that.
And you can do a study longitudinally, or you can try to do
Yeah.
an intervention study to affect affinitive values, but
That's right. And the other thing is, I didn't bring in your dispositional trust on this. And so that piece is also kind of interesting. We tried throwing dispositional trust into this model and it wasn't holding up. And so I'm there's something with this. Are you a trusting person or are you not a trusting person that matters in this equation? And so how do we actually successfully get that in there? This is where it goes back to there is no single analysis. There's no ring to rule them all. In thinking about mixed method approaches and needing that supportive qualitative and with the quantitative as kind of a paired unit feels more comfortable to me.
say that this is causality, but it is based on decades of hearing and thinking about how these things respond. But yeah, without a longitudinal study or a EV.
All the time we have.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Libby.